The fact is, the stats is cooked like the books. We more than pimps, prostitutes, dealers, and crooks. Take a look, same faces on the temple walls. They gave you mad sciences to build pyramids. Today they building more so you can perpetrate like you ball, buying out bars, foreign cars, Audemars, fronting like a star. But you are by birth, and that's the God's honest. No ass just stardust, and the words of promise that you make when you come through like the comets. To live a good natural life in correspondence with the laws of the mother. Love your sister and your brother. Watch them close, but have love for the other. The friend of me turn enemies, man, we suffer when we keep perpetuating the lies. You discover the truth. Yeah. Shout out to all my truth speakers and truth seekers.
Back in the 70s, a man named Dr. William Shockley, a noted scientist, embarked upon the mission of proving to the world that black people are genetically inferior, without, I might add, the benefit of any formal background in genetics. He became front-page news and won headlines with his controversial views. On campus after campus, unrest followed his every visit. My position then and now is that if a supremacist cannot be rationally debated, perhaps he has a point. After the debate you're now going to see, Dr. Shockley went back into oblivion. I don't claim that the interview did it alone, but I am of the opinion that it helped. We have two very prominent educators, scholars, and we feel that it is important to defend the First Amendment rights of all Americans. Dr. William Shockley, one of our guests, has had quite a difficult time speaking at some universities, and particularly some black college students do not agree with his theories. On Black Journal, we feel that Dr. Shockley's rights in the First Amendment area are parallel to black people's rights. That is, that Dr. Shockley must have a platform for his views if black people are to have a platform for their views. Dr. Frances Welsing, on the other side, has difficulty in expressing her views on legitimate mass media outlets because many whites do not agree with her theory of genetics. Now let's find out what the controversy is about. Dr. Shockley, please give us the benefit, basically, of what your theory is.
My principal point, Mr. Brown, is not so much a theory of black-white differences, but is summed up in one word, which is the theme of my appearance on your program and my efforts, and the word is dysgenics. And dysgenics means effectively downbreeding, retrogressive evolution. And I fear that this is worst for the black community, and I particularly welcome an opportunity to appear on Black Journal just for these reasons. And let me say also that when I first met Dr. Welsing, it was not black students who were disrupting, but white students. And Dr. Welsing made a very sincere and I thought extremely effective effort, a well-planned effort. It was not effective with these white students at Staten Island Community College, so I would have a chance to speak. In fact, I think they prevented her from saying what she wanted to say when she was trying to gain me a platform. So my main theme is that we have problems that we should face and we should look at connected with dysgenics, and I welcome any opportunity I have to bring this out so that people can look at it and worry about it.
Dr. Shockley, you are accused of having a theory that is a white racist theory. How do you respond to that?
Well, I respond to that by saying that I've considered whether or not I am a racist. Racist is an epithet that used to damage my self-esteem, but it doesn't anymore. I feel it's untrue. If you look in the dictionary as to what racist means, it means emotional feelings, irrational feelings associated with fear and hate. If I really had those, I don't think I would be here this evening. I feel that what I'm engaged in is a demand for diagnosis, and I'd like to say some more about this chart, which we'll come to probably later, which shows the disproportionate rates of reproduction for the least effective elements of the black community. I'd like to say more about that than we should in just this brief introduction. But I think there is another word that better describes what I'm involved in, and that word is raceology, which means a scientific analysis of racial differences. And I have a faith that reason is a good thing, and I feel, as you do about the First Amendment, but maybe with a slightly different emphasis. I think the really important thing about the First Amendment is it is a way of guaranteeing a high likelihood that truth will emerge as a result of conflicting ideas being expressed, and I have a thesis and a basic belief that truth is a good thing and will be of benefit to man.
Thank you. Dr. Frances Welsing, give us the benefit of your theory, please.
Well, my theory was, I wrote the paper in 1969. I wrote a paper called The Crest Theory of Color Confrontation and Racism. And the sole reason behind writing that paper was an attempt to understand the behavior of white people in relationship to all people of color, every place in the world, black, brown, red, and yellow people. And the paper was presented to the Americans at the National Medical Association, the section on psychiatry, in neurology, because back in 1969, the Black Caucus in the American Psychiatric Association, we had said that racism, and when we talk about racism, we're talking about the white supremacy behavior of white people, that racism was the #1 mental health problem in the nation, and it was the #1 cause of other mental health problems. And I wanted to understand what this thing of racism really is all about, because it's it is the thing that has caused woe and misery and suffering for the vast majority of the people on this planet that are classified as non-white. And in my attempt to understand why the necessity of white people to keep saying that white is superior and that the condition of non-white is inferior. And the more I thought about it, in conjunction with an idea that a friend of mine had, that racism was a worldwide behavioral system for the maintenance of white supremacy by a small minority of people, I put those ideas together with what we know about genetics, what we know about the condition of skin whiteness itself. The condition of skin whiteness is the genetic inability to produce skin pigment called melanin. This is a genetic recessive trait. It is a genetic deficiency state, not as defined by Francis Welsing, but defined by geneticists and dermatologists, that the inability to produce the skin pigment of melanin or melanin pigment is described as albinism. And I think that white people, even though most white people are not consciously understanding their problem in genetics, they are certainly aware that they are genetically dominated by people of color. That's why it was a statement, one drop of black blood makes you black, because people of color have the genetic capacity to annihilate white people. And so unless white people control the reproductivity of people of color, then we can postulate that perhaps one day there won't be any white people. And I think that the very survival of white people necessitates that they project genetic inferiority on people of color, because it is they who really are aware that they are genetic recessive and perhaps genetically inferior to people of color. And I am not saying this to call the condition of skin whiteness to say, well, no, white people are inferior. I'm not saying it for that purpose, but I think that it is of prime importance for the majority of people in the world to understand why it is that white people have to, the effective majority, large numbers of white people, have to move in a hostile and an aggressive way against people of color, and have to constantly focus on it's you who's genetically inferior, because they realize that there's something wrong with their genetic status.
I think I might just at this point say that in a time like 1 hour, we may expose a problem and encourage thinking about it, and this is a very valuable thing. But to cover either Dr. Welsing's views or mine is very important in respect to this question of why I think there may be what proves a basic difference. But I'm going to say that if there were not a basic difference in intellectual capacity in the past, there probably will be a basic difference between black and white intellectual capacity in the future, simply because of the reproduction patterns. And these are Census Bureau data, and this is the most threatening aspect. And what it indicates is that for the black women of the lowest intellectual social class, which are rural farm women, generally the education is least, the average number of children is 5.4. For women with college degrees, it's 1.9. And so this is definitely unfavorable. It is reproducing far more at the bottom end and not enough to keep even at the top end.
Dr. Shockley, can
for
you
whites,
explain?
let me just finish this. For whites, the numbers are also in this direction, but nowhere nearly as severe.
Dr. Shockley, I think that in all fairness, you should explain to the audience why it is that you have, first of all, you have a very large segment of the black population who are on farms, who are deprived in cities. Why don't you explain at the time that you're showing this, who is keeping black people in a situation like they're in? I mean, it could be, you could turn it around the other way, where you could have very large numbers of black people who are exposed to educational opportunities like white people, who are exposed to housing housing, who are exposed to health facilities. Why don't you explain that at the same time that you put figures like that?
I'm sure you would explain it,
No, but I
Dr.
think
Wilson.
it's important
But
in
one
answering.
must say first things first. And you've raised the basic question there, and that is whether the disadvantages are primarily a lack of opportunity or whether they are primarily a basic genetic difference. And let me mention one thing, which is that in certain areas there is no doubt about black superiority. Blacks are superior in visual acuity, and they're superior in a systematic way. Now, I don't expect that people will understand the details of this, but I simply want to show that quantitative work can be done. This happens to be a research job of my own. And what it shows, because these points that you see here lie on a line, which is not the central line, but they lie systematically on a line, what it says is that so far as visual acuity is concerned, blacks are systematically better than whites. It's as if their bell-shaped curve, their distribution curve, were pushed upwards compared to whites for visual acuity, or at least for the avoidance of bad eyesight, such that if the same shift occurred for IQ, it would mean that the average IQ distribution would be up by 9 points rather than down by about 15 points, which is the typical average.
Dr. Shockley, visual acuity is probably something that the system of white supremacy has not necessarily seen the need to affect the environment that black people are in so that it will alter the fact that they have visual acuity that is superior to whites. The fact of visual acuity is not attacked in the same way as educational opportunity and job performance is attacked. And I think that
it's evidence for a genetic difference, in my
Well, you see what I'm saying? There might be many, many more genetic differences where people of color appear superior.
Well, there are enormous differences. In fact, the lesson to be learned from Nazi history is frequently very misunderstood. And it is a lesson which Mr. Bown has told us about earlier. It's the First Amendment. It's not that eugenics is intolerable. Eugenic programs are not inconceivable, they're not inhumane. Denmark has been carrying out programs with strong eugenic implications for maybe 30 years. And it's important to note that since World War II, Denmark's per capita homicide rate dropped and is now approximately 1/20th. That is, the number of deaths of probably being killed in a year by a violent homicide is roughly, the order of 100 times less for young Danes than it is for young American blacks. Now, but the lesson, let me say what the lesson of Nazi history we have in this country, and it will protect us. It's just the thing that makes this program possible. The First Amendment, which allows freedom of speech. If one believes that is not the right answer, then one has to be one of the most anti-German racists there can be. If one believes that the German people would have tolerated the concentration camps and the gas chambers, if news media, like the programs that Mr. Bown is setting on, if those people were willing to bring discordant views out into the open, I don't believe the concentration camps and the gas chambers could have continued to exist in Germany.
I'd like to comment because I'd like to say that I don't think that there's a major difference between what Dr. Shockley is doing. I don't think that Dr. Shockley is fully aware of what he is doing and why he is doing what he's doing. But the long-range implications of what he is doing are no different than the propaganda campaign that Hitler and his Nazi unit carried on in Germany that ended up eliminating 6 million Jewish people. Now, what is most interesting is that Hitler said the very same thing. He said, number one, that the Jews were genetically inferior to the Aryans. Number two, he was aware that the Semites had genetically dominant material, genetic material to the Aryans. And if we begin to understand the way that people who were in Europe at the time that the Semites arrived from Africa, when the Semites arrived in Europe from Africa, they were people who had substantial amounts of color and who had very kinky hair because they were from the continent of Africa. And the Europeans, the white people who were there, had a reaction, a color reaction to the Semites that is no different than the reaction and the concern on the part of people who are white in this area of the world or any other area of the world to people who have the genetic capacity to produce color, who can genetically annihilate their position. And I think it's very, very important. Even though Dr. Shockley, I am convinced that Dr. Shockley believes that he is perhaps elevating science with all of his charts and all of his figures, but he doesn't understand the things that propel him as a white individual in a social system that has programmed him throughout his life and programmed large numbers of people like him to focus on the genetics of people of color in such a way as to destroy people of color.
I would like to ask a question, and Dr. Shockley, if you could answer it yes or no, I would appreciate it. Do you believe that black people are inferior in intelligence because of their heredity?
I have a standard statement. It is not yes or no. It's memorized. I say it at the same time every time, I think. What I say is this. My research leads me, and it's a tragic conclusion, really. My research leads me inescapably to the opinion that the major cause of the American Negro's intellectual and social deficits is hereditary and racially genetic in origin, and thus not remediable to a major degree by practical improvements in environment.
All right. If you believe that the position relatively of black Americans to white Americans is based on a genetic inferiority, and I will accept the responsibility for that word, then what do you see as the solution to the problem?
Well, I see the first aspect of this is to prevent the problem from becoming worse by dysgenics. This first word
Would
that
you
I
translate
mentioned.
dysgenics for me and the audience?
What I
Would that
meant
be sterilization?
No. Dysgenics, you see, means what that other chart I showed you says.
Should blacks,
that the least effective element.
Should blacks be sterilized?
No. I have a...
But if blacks are a problem, and we do not allow...
This is inhumane. And
Dr.
I think one can find more humane solutions to this.
Well, then how would... Then
I would propose something in which one of the key phrases is regardless of sex, race, or welfare status. And this is the proposal. I call it a thinking exercise. It's mentioned in that pamphlet that I showed that you can obtain. And it goes this way, that you would offer a bonus to everyone to be sterilized. Now, we know we have a population explosion problem. We know that in India, that bonuses in the form of transistor radios are offered to people.
Would this bonus be directed to black people specifically, more than whites?
Mr. Brown, what did I say just a moment ago? I said, regardless of sex, race, or welfare status.
Now, there is a group,
that's what I say.
There is a group of white people to whom this offer should be made also.
Absolutely. Now, the offer is based upon the best estimates, best scientific estimates that one can have of any genetically carried disabilities. Now, there are some, I think, that any humane person would have no doubt about. And Dr. Welsing talked about dominant and recessive genes. I want to point out that sometimes a dominant gene can be a very bad thing, and it is a very bad thing for a neurological disease called Huntington's chorea, which is something like multiple sclerosis.
Which is more prominent in white people than black people.
That is correct. And I think that one should offer a large bonus for anyone who might be potentially carrying Huntington's chorea.
Dr. Shockley,
beyond this, it goes on with some other factors in this, but Dr. Welsing wishes to speak.
Are you aware that white people have more genetic diseases that affect their nervous system than people of color than black people?
I wouldn't be at all surprised. And I think blacks apparently have higher heart problems.
Would you suggest that all of these white people who are carrying these defective genes, you know, whose families may carry these defective genes, that they be examined and it would be suggested to them that they be sterilized? Would you suggest this?
Yes, I think I would, probably, in general.
Let me just say this. What is very interesting is in the study of biology, biologists who have studied evolution, one of the very interesting things that they say is that the more functional skin pigment cells in the animal kingdom, the higher you are on the scale of phylogenetic ascension. In other words, nature, in the course of evolution, went to its highest state when it produced a cell that could produce pigment, and that we were sliding backwards. The mutation to albinism is a step backwards in the scale of evolution. Are you aware of that, Dr. Shockley?
No, I'm not aware of that particular one. I am aware of another basic genetic difference, and that is that the rate of maturation of a neurological system gets longer and longer the more advanced the animal is. And that is one of the items on the racial difference, that the neurological development of blacks is faster than whites. Black babies walk on the average a month earlier than white babies. And the period of
black
gestation...
people are much more creative also than white
Dr.
people.
Shockley, correct me if I'm incorrect. Didn't the Giselle schedule, which tested the intelligence of children, make a correlative between intelligence and walking early?
Yes.
And I would think it probably would have been negative.
No, it was not. It was positive.
Well,
the motor skills on the Giselle schedule indicated that earlier precocious walking children, there was a correlation between that and high intelligence.
This may be true. It might be true within a group. I'm not sure of that.
Well, maybe
I know that there is a correlation in terms of things earlier than walking. At the 6-month stage, Nancy Bailey at Berkeley has established that white children who come from the most advanced families and who later, when they become older, are out at the top, at the first 6 months they are relatively retarded compared to children who are from families of less accomplishment and who don't go as far. But so there are a number of these things certainly to be brought in.
Fine.
But
Giselle's schedule is a very authentic, accepted, institutional psychological experiment.
And so is the Nancy Bailey early test.
Thank you.
No, I do not feel that there's any evidence to suggest that 80% of the ability to come to terms with your environment, that has to do with heredity. I think that much of it has to do with the environmental opportunity that the genetic material is exposed to. I think that if we look at the black people, if we just take the black group, and we look at those people who have been able to achieve, and we look at their backgrounds, we will find that they have had substantial social and economic opportunities that maybe some of the segment of the black population has not had. We will find the same thing in the white group. Those white people who have been socioeconomically deprived and at the bottom of the economic scale for whites, that these people are not performing in the same way that people who have extended socioeconomic opportunity. One of the very interesting things is that white women are now talking about women's liberation, and they are looking at their performance relative to white men, and they are saying, and all of the spokesmen for white women, and men and women are also saying, that the reason that the white woman has less confidence in her performance and is not performing as well, relatively speaking, as the white male has been the attitudes within the white family as to the role of the woman versus the role of the man. Now, what is interesting is that when white people are looking at the difference in the performance of the white woman and the white man on IQ tests, they can account for that on the basis of environmental influences. However, when they shift over into looking at whites relative to people of color, somehow they want to drop that understanding and that awareness.
In the continuing wake of the discussion, the historic discussion of black genetic inferiority, I mean, a couple of years ago we were being bombarded with violence in the black community is related to black people's genetics, but not anybody else's violence being related to their genetics. And so now Charles Murray is coming out, and Richard Herrenstein, that black genetic inferiority. And as a matter of fact, Tony, I'm very happy about it. The reason being is that 24 years ago, in my paper, The Crest Theory of Color Confrontation and Racism, White Supremacy, I said that the population that classifies itself as white has to continue to focus on color, genetics, sex, and numbers. And so 24 years after having made that statement, here we go again. So I'm not at all surprised, and I'm glad to have the Crest Theory again validated.
Now, in both Dr. Shockley's conclusion and in the bell curve's conclusion is the conclusion that blacks are uneducable and that public policy needs to be shaped to understand, to conform with the, quote, fact that no amount of money is going to rehabilitate or habilitate, whichever you choose, black people in this country.
Exactly.
What are the implications?
Well, I think, again, the implications, first of all, we need to understand that this discussion doesn't occur in the vacuum. It occurs within what I call a global, national, local system of white supremacy. Now, what do I mean by that? I maintained, and have for the past quarter century, that the behavior that we see, including this focusing, comes about because the white population on the planet is a tiny minority population. It's not people of color who are the minorities. Whites are fewer than 1/10 of the population on the planet. Number two, and perhaps most importantly, white. You see, when white people say, I am white, they are talking genetically about a genetic recessive characteristic that is a variant of albinism, not defined by Francis Welsing. Now that genetic recessive characteristic plus the minority status means that the white population can conceivably be genetically annihilated by genetically dominant black, brown, red, and yellow people in terms of skin coloration. So my thesis in the crest theory was that all of the behavior, you see, the repression of blacks, the attack on black males in particular, the lynching, the castration, the obsession with saying something is wrong with your genetics, because at a subconscious level, whites are aware we are the population on the planet that is genetically vulnerable.
Now, let me give you one exception that I know of, and that is Brazil. During slavery in Brazil, racism as a premise for slavery was as uncommon as racism was a premise for slavery in the United States. And in a Brazil, the white population is diminishing, and the black population is diminishing, and the population in the middle, which is a miscegenated population, is the one that's growing. So I think there.
Well, but see, I would say, Tony, that still, if you
go.
go.
Just finish one point.
I'm sorry.
I just, in my point, I'm not trying to cut you off, but I think my point is, I don't want to sound too abstract. My point is that in some parts of the world, whites don't seem to be as fearful of what you refer to as annihilation, perhaps, as in the United States.
Well, I would still say if one goes to Brazil, and if you go and see who controls the banking centers, it will be a population of people that say we are white.
That's
you see,
yeah,
and
right.
at the same time, if you go to the favelas and into the slums, you see the darkest and the blackest population.
And you're right. And the only thing I'm saying is that population and that population culturally is very different from the United States. And racism wasn't the premise for slavery there, but it was the premise for slavery in the United States.
Well, you see, I say that in other words, there are variations on the theme.
Mm-hmm.
There's variation in terms of the particular language that the discussion is carried out in. But you never get away from, if you're black, stay back, brown, stick around, yellow, mellow, white, right. You see, and the more color you have to cause white genetic annihilation, then the more pressure that is put on you. So this hierarchy of color, whether you're in Asia, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in Latin America, Central America, this still obtains, but I don't want us to get lost.
No, okay, I don't. But I do want to get back to a primary point here, because I think we've jumped over it, and that is the bell curve. And let me just say this, it's not just the bell curve. The week that the bell curve came out, 2 other books came out on the same subject, and they've had so much success. The cover of Time magazine, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report had a feature story, New York Times 2 weeks in a row, very prominent play. The media just grabbed onto this idea. Now, with this happening, there's going to be a plethora of books on this very, very subject.
Precisely.
Now, in this new wave, unlike Shockley and Jensen to a lesser extent, the focus is on, quote, data, meaning that someone is empirically saying that they can demonstrate that there is biological inferiority among blacks, and that it turns on one statistic, and that one statistic is that blacks make, on average, and they were careful to say not individuals but average, because they never could have gotten off the ground with individuals, because too many black individuals are exceptions to this rule. But on average, blacks make 15 points less than whites. Now, what is your direct refutation of that alleged empirical evidence?
Well, do you see, I would say this, that first of all, I'm a psychiatrist, a general psychiatrist, child psychiatrist. We've always looked at IQ tests as being very directly related to the environment. Now, if someone doesn't want to closely examine the environment, all of the dimensions of the environment, then someone could easily say, well, it's not the environment that makes the difference. Do you see, I maintain that it is the environment that makes the difference. And on Sunday, recently, an article was in one of the major newspapers in Washington, D.C., where a young white male, senior at University of Maryland, had his skin darkened, and he went to the South. He could have stayed in Maryland, but he went to the South. He was going to be black because he did not believe when blacks would say it's racism, it's racism. He thought that that was really just an excuse. So he had his skin darkened by a dermatologist, and he went to the South, and he could only tolerate the oppression for 2 days before he came running home and crying to his mother. I can't deal with it. I can't deal with it. Now, what I'm saying is that here is someone who can, you know, the chemical is not given, and so he turns back white. He knew he had that escape, but he couldn't tolerate the insults in the restaurant, the various day-to-day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week assaults that a person of color on his psyche that the person experiences.
Not physically.
Not physically,
but psychologically.
you see, but it's not generally talked about. You see, in other words, he talked about such things as being ignored when he would go into a restaurant, you see, or someone saying, are, you know, no good. Just on and on and on and on.
Now that's one that overt racism, overt
well, I won't even call it overt.
Oh, okay, but
I might call, you see, a shooting or a lynching overt, but I'm talking about the very subtle things.
All right. And you're right. What I would like to do, however, is to identify some other environmental factors that would contribute to this 15-point gap. You've identified one, the subtle erosion of self-esteem, the subtle psychological implantation of the feeling of inferiority, which must manifest itself somewhere under some circumstance. But apart from that, what are some of the other environmental factors that you can identify?
Well, if we understand racism is a system that is operative in all areas of activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. And so this barrage, full court press, is coming at you on a daily basis. If it impacts economics and labor, this means, as is the case in large numbers of black families, you're talking about a one-parent family as opposed to a two-parent family. You're talking about disparage in inadequacies or inequities in terms of wages. And all of this begins to impact on what it is that is happening in that critical unit that we call the family unit. And if that unit cannot function in a supportive manner, for example, black infants, when they are born, in the first 9 months of life are accelerated compared to white infants.
Now, how are they accelerated? How do you mean
they're
that?
accelerated in terms of such things as smiling, holding up their heads, recognition
Motor
of
activity.
faces, and motor activity. Do you see? And smiling is also intellectual activity. But with the assault of this environment, in a highly structured environment that I say is structured for the purpose of white genetic survival, do you see that this begins to then take its toll? It's as though you have two races, two people running a race. One, you tie weights around their ankles, and everything else is equal, but one has weights tied around his or her ankles.
I've seen a number of studies, and frequently they seem to cluster around something happening to a black child around 7 years of age. Have you identified that age at all?
Well,
I see it everywhere. Around 7, something happens to the black child. They grow tremendously up to that point, and then all of a sudden there's a fall off.
Well, you see, the child has entered school at that point. And upon entering school, I mean, try to think about, when I think about what first grade was like, do you see, it was Dick and Jane and Spot and Puff, and a white family. It wasn't anything about a black family. It was a white family. All the pictures were white. All the presidents were white. Everybody that you focused on that was doing anything, Goldilocks, Snow White, everybody is white, including a white Christmas, a white bunny rabbit. You see, so that the child is taking all of this information in about the environment and how he or she is valued or looked upon in the environment. Just learning the English language. You learn that white is pure and black is evil, black is bad. If the stock market falls, it's a Black Tuesday or a Black Monday.
Right, the bottom line, does a 15-point disparity on IQ exams make blacks genetically inferior?
Well, I would say absolutely no. Do you see? We want to get down to genetics. White is a genetic mutation from black. It is albinism. The earliest people, the first people on the planet were black people. And black people produced albinos, and you mix the two together, you get the whole human family. So I say, no, it doesn't mean that. But I want to move. Let's assume, for the purpose of argument, that let's say black people are 50 points below white people. You see, according to their tests, the bottom line is, okay, Dr. Murray, Dr. Jensen, Dr. Shockley, Dr. Herenstein, what is it that you intend to do about this? Do you see? Are you saying, therefore, your model is Adolf Hitler and company? So we have decided that you are inferior. The bottom line is, what are you going to do about it? Because there are many children, white, black, brown, red, or yellow, who are damaged genetically, congenitally. We say they're mentally retarded. Now, we have special schools. We do everything to help these children. We put them in small classes. We give them 3 or 4 teachers. We give them all kinds of things to try to exploit the genetic potential. But now somebody comes along and says a 15-point difference means we cannot expect anything from these people. Well, if we cannot expect anything and the global economy is declining, well, gosh, we're back with Adolf. Do you see? Well, we just cannot tolerate this debris in our population.
If I may, and I want you to continue your point. I don't want to interrupt. I do want to say this. I read an editorial recently on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, not a newspaper to take lightly. And the writer was very favorable, anti the bell curve. This was not a racist writing an article. It was a very, very objective, fair editorial. And he mentioned the eugenics movement that the Chinese are involved in terms of, in China, of culling out the bottom and reproducing the top. And he concluded that if the liberals kept on making more out of the bell curve than it is, we may see, quote, a Beijing solution in the United States.
Well, let's not go to a Beijing solution where we have a Nazi Germany solution. Do you understand? Where it wasn't just a population. I mean, there have been many populations. If a child is born defective, do you see, they do not allow that child to go on and exist. That's quite different. That's quite different than saying there are populations of people.
Genocide.
Do you see, that are superfluous and that are a contaminant, and we need to be pure and clean so that we can really arrive where we're supposed to arrive. We're back in Nazi Germany. So I say that, first of all, we have to recognize Nazi Germany was about white supremacy. It was about the white genetic population feeling that it was vulnerable to an assault by people whose real genetic origin began in North Africa. You see, their religion was not the critical issue. The issue was that they had their origins in a population that was classified as non-white. And so I say that we need to not debate numbers, because God forbid, but Dr. Murray or his grandchildren might come out with an IQ difference 15 points lower than his.
My next question will operate on the premise that your statement there is objective. Therefore, I will go to the next point. If what you're saying is true, are blacks doing anything to accelerate a process toward a, quote, final solution?
Well,
blacks themselves?
No. Do you see, the people of color on the planet who are being approached by people who have all these genetic issues in their minds, and they don't understand that white supremacy mindset, or the mindset that is feeling vulnerable to white genetic annihilation. So you have a big population conference in Cairo. To the extent that people of color on the planet do not understand this mindset, it's like being at the chessboard and not understanding the game with all of the people of color on the planet on the black side of the chessboard. And you have white supremacy, or the dynamic for white genetic survival, moving against this group of people. Now, I believe, instead of getting emotionally upset about Charles Murray's position or anybody who is in that group of thinkers, I believe, again, take out the crest theory, see where all of this has been laid out before, predicting how this mindset operates, and begin to place oneself in a mode of understanding what the game is that is on the table.
If I can summarize the game is going to turn on public opinion. Hitler only did what he was able to do, and he was only able to do certain things because he had organized German public opinion. What, if anything, are blacks or some blacks doing in terms of accelerating a negative public opinion, or a public opinion that could come back to bite them? That's
all right. Well, let's take an example. a person who considers him or herself to be an actor, television actor, black, who doesn't understand this white supremacy dynamic. So somebody comes along and offers them a job, you see, but they have to act as a clown and a buffoon, and they just think, well, I'm in the abstract being an actor or an actress. Unbeknownst to them, it's a whole context in which this role is being carried out, where people feel who have set up this image that they need to be reinforced. See, look at blacks. They're clowns. They're stupid. They're buffoons. Look at this. This is trash.
Let's look at daytime television. Look at it for me, will you, with the eyes of a psychiatrist.
All right, the daytime talk shows.
Yes.
All right, I would say that there are many black people that are being tapped. I don't know where they go to find these people. You see, but it's as if it's the parallel would be if a white person who's putting on a television show decides, let me go and get the least advantaged white person and put them up on the television continually, not the most beautiful, the most articulate, the most intelligent. No, let me go to the poorest area where there are white people and then put them up continually as a model for what white people are all about. You see, we go back to Nazi Germany and Joseph Goebbels, who understood if we keep putting out negative images of Semites of the Jewish religion, we can train the population to say, look, they're animals. They're not human. And so the sooner we get rid of them, the better. I think that many talk shows are using and trashing black people in this manner, in addition to some of the shows that come on in the evening. I can think of one of the shows that just trashes the image of black men. We complained in the 50s and the 60s and maybe the 40s about the Amos and Andy image. Those are angelic images compared to the images of black men, you see, that are being put on the television, and this is supposed to be entertainment. Some of the people who walk around and have to hold their heads down who are white are people whose origin is German or white South African, because they are known throughout the world to have brutalized people. You see, they're ashamed of themselves. And so I would say to white people, it's very important for them to look further than what somebody says is an objective IQ score and begin to hold the mirror up.
Yeah, I'm redneck. I always have been. Many years I was a racist. I didn't like blacks. They used to call me N-word and whatnot. And I come a point and realize there's some personal experiences. That white people are racist. Not all of them, but white culture is. Our white country is. Our nation is. Our American culture is full of white supremacy. And we live in a white supremacist culture that caters to white people. Everything from the media to education to art to culture to politics is whitewashed. What is not whitewashed? As far as the status quo, as far as the dominant culture, everything's whitewashed. This country was built for white people. And it's time us Americans, us white Americans, came to terms with that and realized we're benefiting from that. We created slavery. We created a culture and a system of white supremacy that has benefited us for 400 years. You think maybe it's about time we stop being lazy as white people and take some responsibility? I can tell you as an ex-redneck, as an ex-racist, now I'm still redneck. I boat, fish, hunt, I'll drink a beer, I eat too much pork, barbecue, you can tell looking at me. But my point is, and yeah, y'all can call me fat. I don't give a damn. I'm going to always have a lot of haters, I always have. But there's a new South, a new America, and it's called white racial responsibility. And it's time we all took some, y'all. So let's take a little bit of white racial responsibility. Let's start by standing up against it. Let's recognize that in every American institution, education, financial, healthcare, justice, for God's sake, it's injustice, in the police departments and our police officers, many of them. And when I talk, I'm not talking about all. I ain't saying all white people are bad. I'm saying we've got an evil called white supremacy in this damn culture. Stop being defensive. Do something about it. Speak up. Don't ever listen. Don't ever ignore racism. If you hear something racist, stand up as a white American. Take some responsibility. It's the inaction that has always destroyed other peoples and other nations. It's the inaction. It's the indifference. It's that damn, oh, well, it'll take care of itself attitude. Oh, I don't see color. By God, you better see color. If you don't see color, then how are you going to help it? How are you going to fix it? Our system sees color. Our culture sees color. We're indoctrinated to see color. Don't tell me you can't see color. See color. See the black experience. See the brown experience. See what we did to Native Americans. See what colonization did. Look what the Crusades did. Get educated. Open book. Read, watching video. Watch Roots again. Watch Malcolm X. Do something. Think outside of the white box. Black people live it every day. Brown people live it every day. Think beyond your own experience. Think beyond your own self. Imagine the privileges that you have just because of your skin. I ain't saying you ain't suffered. We all suffer. Stop being defensive. What I'm saying is that we get certain privileges. We're not harassed by the police. Okay? We're not denied a house loan or denied to live in a neighborhood. We're not uncomfortable living in rural America. I'm not uncomfortable living in rural America, but I tell you what, a lot of black people don't even want to drive through where I live. Why? Racist. We're racist. So I'm not saying white people are bad. Stop being defensive. I'm saying take some responsibility. All people are equal. God made us that way. Well, let's knock this supremacy out of our country. So I'm just saying, white America, wake up. Look in the racial mirror and look at what we have done. Look at how we benefit. And let's do something about it. Let's speak up. Let's vote. Let's create legislation and policies. Let's make things fair and equal. Let's take some responsibility and never, ever, ever ignore any form of racism that you see or experience or witness. Always speak up and act up. Please. Thank you.
I am a black Egyptian. My father is much darker than I am. My mother is lighter than I am. In Egypt, people are identified by the religion first, not the race. So in Egypt, if you are Christian, you are a minority person. But if you're black, you're not a minority person. You are a part of the mainstream society. And I came from this background. And in Egypt, you identify as Arab and as Muslim. And in this country, when I first came, I identified myself as Arab American and Muslim first. And gradually, I became to identify myself as black. I came to the U.S. in 1978. And I became a U.S. citizen in 1985. When I became a U.S. resident, I was told by the Immigration and Naturalization that I am white. And I told them that I'm black, and they said, no, in this country, you are white. All Arabs in this country, all Arab immigrants are white. I didn't pay much attention in the beginning to this, because in the Arab world, we identify with our ethnicity first as Arabs, and then with the race second as black or white or whatever. But in this country, you identify with your racial group first, and then with your ethnicity second. Gradually, I became black first and Arab second. And I rejected my white classification publicly for the first time in 1987, in February, as a panelist in a function sponsored by the Association of the Study of Black Life and History in Detroit. I said that I belong to two minority groups. I'm Arab American and Black American, and I'm racially black and ethnically Egyptian. I was harassed by my employer right after that. I work for a white school district. The superintendent is white. All the associate superintendents are white, even though that we provide services to 30% black population. But the organization is white and the approach is very white. The attitude towards me changed completely after I went out publicly and rejected my white classification. One coworker came to me and told me, a white coworker came to me and told me right after the function that he met with the superintendent, and if I don't keep my mouth shut, my educational career is over. He said, you have nothing to do with these people, you have a history and a culture. These people came from the jungle, you have nothing to do with them. These people lie and steal. When I see one of them in my neighborhood, I call the police. And I was told by the director of general education, who is retired now, in '88, I was told by him that I get people angry when I say that I'm black Egyptian. If I just say that I'm Egyptian, I would get along. I have to add that I was denied promotion twice because I chose black classification. This is part of my 2 lawsuits against my employer, which are currently pending. 2 lawsuits.
Now, just for the education of our viewership, why don't you share with us a breakdown of Egypt as it is today, insofar as blacks or combinations thereof of European descent and what have you?
We don't have Egyptians of European descent in Egypt. We have a population which is basically which is basically a mixture of ancient Egyptian blacks who intermarried with Arabs right after the Arab conquest. The ancient Egyptian population was brown and black before the Arab conquest. But before the Arab conquest came the Greeks. It was the ancient Egyptian population was in Egypt for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptian population was brown and black. And the Greeks came in 300 BC. And they started to intermarry with the local population. And then the Romans came and ruled from 70 BC until they were conquered by the Arabs and kicked out by the Arabs in the 7th century. And these people intermarried with the Egyptian Copts. And they made the pigmentation of the Egyptians, the Copts, much lighter because of this intermarriage with Europeans.
Now, you're an educator, okay? Now, how do you deal with situations when you practice your profession insofar as dealing with the mythology or the misconceptions about Egypt being a white civilization? How do you deal with that?
This is a big problem because Egypt, the ancient Egyptian civilization was a black civilization, and ancient Egyptians were black according to the Greek scholars and the Roman scholars. Ancient Egypt became white only in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And the scholar who is responsible for this is Seligman, the noted anthropologist from England, Seligman. White supremacy argues that blacks are inferior than white intellectually. They are subhuman and they are incapable of building a civilization. White supremacy had one dilemma until Seligman came. The dilemma was ancient Egypt was black according to the Greek and the Roman scholars. 10 of them said that, including Aristotle and Plato. 10 of them said that in writing. They had this dilemma. Ancient Egyptian was black. So if blacks are inferior intellectually and are incapable of building a civilization, how come the ancient Egyptians built a civilization? Seligman found the solution for this dilemma. He came up with a theory called the Hamite theory. He separated the blacks who built a civilization in Egypt and Ethiopia from the rest of the black race, and he called them brown-skinned whites, or the Hamites. So Seligman saved white supremacy from this dilemma, and all the white scholars followed him from that time on. This was at the end of the 19th century. And since that time, white scholarship says that ancient Egypt is white.
Mustafa Hefni is currently working on his doctorate degree at Wayne State University. His dissertation topic is a content analysis of the treatment of ancient Egypt in world history textbooks. And just how far is this determined Egyptian willing to go to be classified black?
I want to carry my case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court if necessary.
Which means all these people that are operating in government are absolutely imposters.
That's right. Even though this was dismissed, whatever the status is, it still serves as case law for Moorish Americans.
Yes, they should be looking at it.
This is how you got to use law, because this hit the court. This hit the National Court of the Supreme Court of the United States. So what that means now is if he petitioned to be black, and then they say, well, no, you can't do that, you are not black, then that's case law and grounds for you to counter this and say, well, if he can't be black, then neither can I.
You're Sicilian, huh? Sicilian. You know, I read a lot, especially about things, about history. I find it fascinating. Here's a fact, I don't know whether you know or not. Sicilians were spawned by Sega.
Come again?
No, it's a fact. Yeah. You see, Sicilians have black blood pumping through their hearts. And no, if you don't believe me, you can look it up. Hundreds and hundreds of years ago, you see, the Moors conquered Sicily, and the Moors are again. See, way back then, Sicilians were like wops from northern Italy. They all had blonde hair and blue eyes. But, well, then the Moors moved in there and, well, they changed the whole country. They did so much with Sicilian women. huh? That they changed the whole bloodline forever. That's why blonde hair and blue eyes became black hair and dark skin. You know, it's absolutely amazing to me to think that to this day, hundreds of years later, that Sicilians still carry that gene. Now this, I'm quoting history. It's written. It's a fact. It's written.
I know this guy.
No. Your ancestors are. Hey. Yeah. And your great-great-great-great-grandmother are getting it off. Oh, yeah. And she had a half a kid. Now, if that's a fact, tell me, am I lying? 'Cause you're part eggplant.
No!